develop project charter. This is a process in which you want to develop the charter, of course, now. But what's the charter? A charter is your document. That authorizing document. It formally says the project has started or the project exists. So it authorizes the existence of a project. It formalizes the existence of a project. The project charter is that authorizing document that says you, the project manager, you are now assigned to the project. So it gives the project manager the authority to be able to even be a project manager, the authority to be able to apply organizational resources to project activities. So you can see this as a matriculation ceremony. You know, on an average higher institution, on a campus, you can spend 500, you can spend 2-3 years on that campus, walking around, even attending lectures. As long as you have not been matriculated, you are just somebody wandering about on the campus. It is the matriculation that makes you a bona fide student of the institution. So it is a charter that makes you a project manager on a project. It formalizes the assignment of the project manager to the project, without which the project manager is just running errands for the sponsor. So please note that a project manager is assigned early in the project, because the charter is done at the initiating stage of the project. It is when the project manager is assigned that you can now proceed with other things on the project. So it is always before planning, always before planning, always before planning. Why? Because the planning will be carried out by the project manager. So you cannot assign the project manager during planning, because all planning activities, the planning activities are supposed to be managed by the project manager and the team in relation to all the other entities. Okay, so I think it's correct to say if there is no charter, there is no project. If there is no charter, there's no project. So when the charter has been approved, has been signed off, that's when the project has life. That's when the project has been brought into existence. It documents the main details of the project. So you can see the charter as like a takeoff point for the project. The charter consists of some base information to give the project manager a takeoff point from which the project manager will now start planning the project. The project manager starts to develop on the project based on the fundamental information that the sponsor is assigning to the project manager. So please note that the charter is written by the sponsor. Someone of sufficient authority has to write the charter. The charter is not to be written by any other person or group of people. But the sponsor can exercise the right of delegating writing the charter to anybody. In fact, the charter can be delegated. Writing the charter can be delegated. So even the project manager, whoever wants to be the project manager, the sponsor can delegate writing the charter to that person. But there's a key point here. What that person is writing is a draft. You are writing a draft of the charter. It is until it has been brought back to the sponsor and the sponsor agrees to the content, approves the content, and signs off the charter. That is when it becomes a charter. What you had before was just a draft written by somebody else, delegated by the sponsor to play that role. So essentially, the sponsor still holds that right as the person who signs off the charter, even if writing the charter is delegated to somebody else. So what are the various things you have in the charter? Remember, we said the charter consists of base information to guide the project manager on activities going forward on the project. So in your charter, you have something called the preliminary scope statement. We'll discuss this. Let's just say something about preliminary scope statement. When you want to work on a project, essentially, it's important for you would necessarily have some information to say, okay, we want to work this project to be able to achieve blah, blah, blah. We want this project to do XYZ. So some over the top preliminary overview of what the project wants to do. That's your preliminary scope statement. Another thing you have here is your authority level of the project manager. Remember we discussed earlier that in some cases, you might not have a full project manager on a project. You could have someone at the level of a project coordinator. You could have someone at the level of a project expediter. So your project manager, as assigned to the project, the level of authority that the project manager would have been specified in a document. For example, are you simply coordinating matters? You don't have access, you don't have authority to hire and fire. There are cases in which the sponsor actually constitutes the project team. There are cases like that. There are cases in which the sponsor specifies the kind of access to resources that the project manager has. Okay, for example, you are carrying out a project in a functional organization. The sponsor could mention in the charter to say all resources are to be managed and controlled by the functional manager. So you go through the functional manager when you want to have access to resources. So all matters regarding the authority and use of resources are to be specified in the charter. Then you have constraints and assumptions. All projects have assumptions. All projects have assumptions. You cannot have every information as a fact and you have empirical data backing you. There are times in which you just make assumptions and you proceed. So when you make assumptions, you want to put it in the charter. For example, you are proceeding on this project with the assumption that the dollar to pound sterling exchange rate will not go beyond XYZ. That's an assumption. You don't have it for a fact that it wouldn't. So you want to progress on the project with that assumption. You could also have the assumption. There's lots of assumptions I could have on the project. Then constraints. There would be limiting factors. Constraints are essentially limiting factors. For example, you could have it as a constraint that you have to complete this project on time before rainy season starts. That's a constraint. So all constraints that the sponsor has in mind to guide the project manager, you want to put it in the charter. Then we have stakeholder definition and level of influence. There are times in which the sponsor wants to guide the project manager by identifying stakeholders for this project manager. For example, you could say, Mr. Johnson is director of works. He's going to be a key person interfacing with you on this project. So what is he doing there? The sponsor is guiding the project manager by identifying Mr. Johnson as a stakeholder on the project and even telling the project manager the level of influence. Then you also have time and cost goals. Time here could mean is also schedule. You could have, as a project manager, the sponsor is to guide on, okay, what's your base idea of the budget of the project. Please note that the budget of the project, the real budget of the project, will be gotten by the project manager after detailed planning of the project. But that does not mean that at the initiating stage of the project manager should not be guided about what the sponsor has in mind, how much the sponsor is willing to drop, the sponsor's idea or estimate of how much the project will cost. The same thing goes for timing, schedule of the project. There are times in which the sponsor wants to guide the project manager to say, okay, I want this project to be completed before the end of the year. We want this project to be completed by Q3 of the year. So that's a guide. So the sponsor gives this guide. The project manager plans the project, taking into consideration this guiding information, and the project manager comes back to the sponsor after planning. When the project manager plans the project, at that point the proper schedule of the project gets clearer. At that point, the proper budget that has been arrived at after detailed planning, it gets clearer. Then the sponsor comes back, and the project manager comes back to the sponsor to say, this is what you wanted us to work towards, but based on our planning, this is what we have been able to achieve. This is what we have been able to come up with. What's your opinion? How do we proceed? So essentially, the sponsor guides the project manager with some base targets, some base goals for budget of the project, some base goals for how long the sponsor wants the project to take. The sponsor also gives the project manager information about the organization. That is, in cases in which maybe you are engaging a third-party consultant, project manager, or any other. The sponsor is to guide with as much organizational information as possible. Please understand that projects are not commissioned, they are not managed in a vacuum. So if projects are managed in the context of an organization, the project manager wants to have sufficient information about the organization, because at the end of the day, you want the project to align with organizational goals, organizational mission and vision, and all of these things. So these things will help you a lot going forward when you have to prioritize, and many more instances in which having knowledge of the organization will help you in making choices. And then project justification. We'll discuss this, the business case, and all of that, and similar concepts. When you know the business justification, you want to know the why. Why is this project coming into existence? When the project manager knows the why, it will be easy for the project manager to be able to take some decisions. It will be easy for the project manager to understand where the project is coming from, and that would guide in lots of decision making and prioritizing on the project. So what are some general characteristics of a charter? Number one is the charter gives the project life. The charter includes high-level scope statements that we call preliminary scope statements, and then constraints, assumptions, schedule, and cost goals. The charter gives the project manager authority to apply resources to the project. It includes the business need or the reason that the project was undertaken to address. Understand the fact that the charter is issued by a manager, by someone external to the project, at a level appropriate to the needs of the project. What we are saying here is that someone not part of the core project team has to be the person issuing the charter. You cannot have a member of the project team issuing the charter. No, someone outside, someone that has sufficient authority, because the sponsor here is in charge of funding the project. Someone who has that authority, because the project manager would necessarily have to revert to that person at numerous points in the project. The charter is signed and approved by the sponsor. When we say sponsor, it's not all the time that the sponsor is one person. The sponsor could be a group of people. It could be a group of people playing the role of the sponsor, or it could be a group of people delegated by that individual called the sponsor to play some of the role of the sponsor. As much as possible, the charter should be a physical document. As much as possible, it should be a physical document. It's not advisable to take your charter as a verbal communication. As much as possible, it should be physical. If not possible, it should be a digital document, not a verbal. Please ensure that you don't start projects based on verbal. Well, there are cases in which you have no choice, but as much as possible, even when the sponsor is trying to be informal in giving you the charter. What you do as a professional, or one of those things you could do as a professional, is take the verbal instruction, write the charter yourself, and take it back for approval. It is very important that you manage the risk of ambiguity. You manage the risk of different people having different assumptions on the project. Whatever has been given to you verbally, document these things, take it back for approval. Let there be evidence that the sponsor said this, such that it doesn't lead to argument and many other unpleasant circumstances later on in the project.